Imam al-Ghazali was the one who introduced logic into the methodology of the usuli scholars. He actually, in his famous book called Al-Mustasfa, the first 40 pages are an introduction to logic. And this is also what he introduced into the way of the mutakallimin also. So these become very important tools in our tradition. This argument that logic is prohibited is, as far as I'm concerned, it's really something that's very dangerous, because when Imam Nawawi said that it was haram, he was talking about a type of philosophy, because at that time, logic was not separate from philosophy. It was actually studied as part of the peripatetic tradition, and they were worried about people going astray with this. That's why they prohibited it. It had nothing to do with the actual subject itself. It had to do with the people that were teaching it and the methodology with which it was taught. But Imam al-Ghazali, who mastered Ibn Sina's work on logic and then basically began to use it in his methodological approach, it becomes very important. And this is why our scholars always study. And I'll tell you something, in what's currently called Saudi Arabia, in Medina, there's a university there, which was started in the 1960s to teach Islam to not just the Saudis, but internationally. But it focused on a certain school within Islam, which is the Salafi school. Now, the Salafi school originally was a Hanbali school, and there's a long history of how they departed from the madhab tradition, because the early people, they're called Wahabis. They don't like to be called Wahabi, but these people traditionally were Hanbalis, but they had an Athari creed, and they did not like speculative kalam. They didn't like any of the Ash'ari or the Maturi tradition, but they had a great Mauritanian teacher there, Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti, who I was fortunate enough to actually have studied with his son and heard many stories about him. I lived in his house for a time when I was in Medina. So Muhammad al-Amin al-Shinqiti adopted, he left the Mauritanian minhaj and adopted the minhaj there. He was a brilliant scholar, and he wrote a famous tafsir called Adwa al-Bayan. But because he was a master of usul al-fiqh, and especially of the usuli tradition, which is based on Imam al-Ghazali's work, because Ibn Qudama, who wrote Rawdat al-Nadir, which is the usuli textbook of the Hanbali school, it's basically an abridgment of Imam al-Ghazali's usul. So to learn it without logic made it much more difficult. So he actually wrote, because they considered at that time it was prohibited to teach logic, he wrote a logic book for Medina University, but changed all the, he called it Adab al-Bahth wal-Munadhara. So he put all the logic in it, which is another science, Adab al-Bahth wal-Munadhara, which is related to logic. But he actually taught them logic without calling it logic, because he knew how beneficial it was. So this idea that some Muslims have that they shouldn't use logic, it's just really, it's just not, it's not healthy. Because part of the crisis that we're in is people aren't thinking clearly. Thinking and feeling are two ways in which human beings experience. We think things through and we feel things. And feelings are very important, but feelings should never override thinking when you're dealing with momentous matters. Feelings are much more important in things like love, like you don't have an intellectual relationship with the one you love. I mean, you could, that could be part of the relationship, but that relationship that's founded in muwadda and mahabba, that's not intellectual. That's something related to the emotions. It's very different. So thinking and feeling can become confused in people. And one of the things that logic teaches you is to check your feelings and to become more objective in approaching things. And also because in material logic, you're actually taught the fallacies. So there's things, for instance, there's fallacies like collectivizing. It's very common for people to make hasty generalizations. So if you have a bad experience, say you go to New York and you have 3 cab drivers all from the same country, they're immigrants, and they cheat you, all 3 of them, and then you just assume all people from that country are thieves. That's crazy to do that, because you're going to, by stereotyping people, you're going to wrong people from that country that aren't cheaters or thieves. And then the other thing is to look at it that maybe they didn't cheat you. I mean, you might be wrong about that. That's David Foster Wallace, his approach in This Is Water, that sometimes what we think is going on is not actually going on. It's in our minds. So these are aspects of our tradition that have been neglected for too long. and we really need to revive them. We need to revive the centrality of grammar, and we also need to revive, again, logic.